Good afternoon. Could I have your attention, please? I hope you'll all agree that it's been an amazing annual meeting so far. We've been challenged, we've been inspired, we've even been entertained. And we have one more treat in store for you today. The Society prides itself on being a convener of the international law community, creating opportunities to hear from and dialogue with major international institutions engaged with issues of international law and policy. And it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce to you Sandy Okora, Senior Vice President and Group General Counsel of the World Bank Group. Now, I don't need to explain to this group, as I do to some, what the World Bank Group is comprised of. We have IBRD, we have IDA, we have IFC, we have MIGA, and of course, ICSID. And as Sandy has already heard, Meg Kinnear is well known to this organization, having served in leadership capacities, and there are others at the bank who've been very active in our group. But let me tell you about Sandy. She was appointed Senior Vice President and General Counsel of the bank in February 2017, following a successful private sector career in the United Kingdom. And if I'm not mistaken, this is her first outing, her maiden voyage in this capacity. Sandy qualified first as a barrister and then requalified and trained as a solicitor in the United Kingdom. Immediately prior to joining the World Bank Group, she was General Counsel of HSBC Global Asset Management and Deputy General Counsel of HSBC Retail Banking and Wealth Management. The list of accolades she's received for her work, including her volunteer efforts, are numerous, and I'm just going to name a few. In 2015, she was named in the Power List 2015 as the 4th most influential Black person in Britain. In July 2016, she was named one of the 100 women to watch by the Female FTSE Board, and just last November, she received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the UK's Black Solicitors Network. She's an intellectual leader in her field and played a key role during the financial crisis, particularly with respect to the mitigation of counterparty risk exposure. But she also has outside interests as well. In late 2013, she became a council member of a human rights organization, Justice. And from 2010 to 2016, she was ambassador for the Law Society of England and Wales, participating in its Diversity Access Scheme. From January to June 2014, she was president of International Lawyers of Africa, ILFA, having previously served as a director of that organization for many years. Throughout her career, she's been a champion and strong promoter of gender equality. And it's therefore only natural that her chosen topic for today's keynote focuses on gender, more specifically gender-based violence. Now, the cost of gender-based violence is staggering. It represents a worldwide $1.5 trillion, the equivalent of the GDP of Canada, not to mention the loss of over 200 million women's lives worldwide, comparable to the population of Brazil, Pakistan, or Nigeria. Her speech will reflect on her personal experience as a female international lawyer and present the life stories of courageous and inspirational women on every continent who have suffered extreme violence, yet avidly fought for the rights of other women. Sandy has asked me to note that she will be speaking today in her personal capacity, and her views do not necessarily reflect the views of the World Bank Group or its member states. For this reason, she will not be taking questions following her remarks, but she looks forward to meeting and speaking with many of you during the reception that will follow. So without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Sandy Okora.
Gosh, it's bright up here. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see all of you here today, and I want to thank ASIL very, very much for the wonderful invitation to inviting me here tonight to make a keynote speech. I am truly honored and very privileged to be standing here in front of you. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. I know you've probably heard quite a lot of speakers say that, but this is very acute for me. At the start of my legal career, I was told by many people that because of my gender and because of my race, there would be many doors closed to me. There would be many tables to which I would not have been invited to sit, and there would be glass ceilings I wouldn't be able to break through. I was told to keep my head down, keep quiet, don't make a fuss. In other words, to be seen and not heard. Well, I suppose these people were coming from a good place of trying to protect me, but I wasn't having any of it. I decided way back then that was not going to be my story. So I stand in front of you now, having burst through all those doors, having sat at all those tables, and having shattered all the glass ceilings behind me as the first ever Black female general counsel at the World Bank. I am not a hidden figure, and this evening I will be seen and I will be heard. So what do I want to say? As Lucinda said, I'm here to talk about gender. I've spent a long time in my career promoting gender equality, diversity, and inclusion. So having an opportunity like this was not one to be missed, and not one to be afraid of. I think someone is calling. Gender-based violence is something I know that affects men and affects women as well. It's not just a female issue. But for the purposes of this talk, I am going to concentrate on the effects that it has on women. If you put it on silent, it usually works. Gender-based violence can be seen as a very special term in terms of the violence that it is particularly covering, but for the purposes of what I'm going to say, I'm going to cover all types of violence that women face, from physical, sexual, psychological, harassment, and just the threat of it as well, because that is often forgotten, the threat of it. And I know that many of you may be expecting an academic, legalistic speech from me tonight. Let me just manage your expectations. You're not going to get one. So to avoid you wriggling in your seats or playing with your phones or even answering your phones, you might want to head for the exit now if that's what you're expecting. If not, settle down, kick your shoes off, and I will crack on. One thing I just want to do before I sort of get into the heart of my speech is I'm aware that this is going to be put on YouTube. And going back to what I was saying at the beginning, there are going to be many people who will be watching this at the end of their phone all over the world. Some of them may be lawyers, some of them may not be lawyers. And many of them may be very aspiring lawyers who one day would like to be sitting in this room, would maybe even like to be standing at this podium giving a keynote speech. And I just want to say this bit to them. Don't give up on your dreams. Don't let anyone stamp on your aspirations. Your aspirations are valid. And if you are dreaming one day, like I dreamt one day of being a lawyer and standing somewhere like this and doing a fabulous job like the job that I do at the World Bank, don't give up on that. You can do it. Thank you. What a nice crowd. At this point, I'm going to just say, and reiterate what Lucinda said. These are my own personal views. That would be very obvious. But it's also not a critique of the law. It's not a summary of any particular jurisprudence. I want to take you through some personal stories that relate to gender-based violence. The law is very important in this respect, and I will be touching upon that. But what I want to overlay that with are the real stories behind this, because we mustn't forget that. We mustn't sanitize it in a way where we're just looking at the law. We've got to remember the stories of the real women that led up to some of the changes that we have seen. But let me start with and put a bit in context and talk a little bit about me. I have my wonderful assistant Christian in the front who's going to manage the clicker. He doesn't trust me with it, so he is going to click through. But I want to put it, as I said, in a bit of context and talk a little bit about my journey and how they're interlaced with some of the journeys of the women that I'll be talking about. So, Christian. That's me there with my mum and my dad. My mum is between my father, who's in the dark suit, and my uncle there. That's in a place called Fulham in London in the 60s. It's where I was born, where I grew up. Really normal childhood. My dad was a teacher, my mum was a nurse. We didn't have much money, but I was very loved and I was very well looked after. And my love of fashion started very early, as you can see. Also, my love of party started very early too. And but I put that picture up to illustrate that there was quite a large diaspora of Nigerians, which is where my dad was from, and Trinidadians where my mother was from, in London. So I grew up with that sort of bicultural heritage. So I'm a Brit, I'm a Trini, I'm a Nigerian, and now I'm an American. So, you know, a really interesting life and a very ordinary one. And here are some more sort of pictures that really sort of show the pictures we all have in our picture boxes somewhere that came all the way with me from England. And I just want to say a bit about two of these pictures. The first one I want to talk about is that one where you can see of me sitting on the sofa. I was about 8 or 9 then. And either just before that picture was taken or just after that picture was taken was the first time I really felt that prick of racism. And I'll tell you what happened. So I grew up in a place in London. My mum and dad moved from Fulham, and I grew up in a place in London called Balham. I don't know if anybody knows Balham. Probably not. No hands. Oh, hello. Some people are admitting to it. They know Balham. It's very posh now, but it wasn't very posh when I grew up there in the 70s. But it was, it's a very comfortable place. But when I was at school, the teacher was going around and asking all the young boys and girls in the room what they wanted to do when they grew up. And I was very keen to give my answer because I was hearing some particularly stupid answers, like being a footballer and nothing wrong with being a footballer, but they couldn't play football. Being a princess, things like that. And I thought, I can't wait for it to be my turn because I have got such a sensible answer. So, and as you can see, I was a sensible type if you look at all the bows and everything. When the teacher came to me, she said, "Okay, Sandy, what do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to be a judge." And there was a silence, and there was a pause, and she looked me right in the eye, and she said to me, "Sandy, little black girls from Balham don't become judges." Now, though she would be sacked for that today, And it's quite an astonishing thing to think that anyone could say that to a young child. But that was quite common back then, and no one thought much of it. In fact, most people probably thought it was true. But I thought to myself, no, that's not going to be true. Again, that's not going to be my story, and if they don't, they're going to now. Now, I'm not a judge, let me just say that. But I don't see it as a failure. One can always aspire. But it was a lesson for me not to have my aspirations dampened. But that kind of thing that was happening to me was the only thing that was happening to me. I wasn't facing any threat of violence, any threat of an early marriage, any threat of anything else at all. We all have our things to face and our challenges to overcome. But really, in the scheme of things, they were not enormous challenges. And just before we move on, my mother is sadly passed away, but if she's watching, I put that picture up. She hates that last picture of me, that school picture, because I hadn't done my hair, as you can see, for the picture, and she hid that set of pictures away. She was that particular. And I only found them after she died. And I thought, I'm going to put it up today because I've got a whole set of me at school except that one. And I found them because she was very, very, very particular woman. And so having a fantastic mother who guided me and made sure I was safe, even down to making sure I looked absolutely immaculate every day, was something I really appreciate, because that's not the life that everybody has. So moving on. I did normal things, went to university, went traveling. That's in Penzance, the most southerly cafe in England. Yes, I went very far. I pretended to learn to play the saxophone, did all those normal things that everybody does, went to university, studied law, etc., etc. Got my first pot plant, and my first, got the pot plant faster than the flat, and did fairly normal things. But now to the serious bit. Not long after that picture was taken, I had my first experience of witnessing gender-based violence. And so there was I, happy, content in my new home with my plants, thinking life was going to be great. I'm now a lawyer, I'm going. A friend of mine had come for the evening. We were going to watch TV. And we suddenly heard this horrible noise outside, screaming and banging. And it was quite clear that someone was being attacked or beaten up. So we went outside, and to my shock and horror, my neighbor was being beaten up by her husband in the front drive, right next door in front of everybody. And he was banging her head against the bonnet, I think you call it the hood, the bonnet of the car. It was making a horrible noise. She was screaming. He was grabbing her by the hair. I was absolutely shocked. I had never seen anything like it except in TV programs. The idea that this was happening right next door to me was shocking. Now, I think because I had never experienced violence like that before, I'd never seen it, it was not something I was accustomed to, I wasn't necessarily scared by it. So I got myself between my neighbor's husband and her and stopped it from going on. I did not think that men hit women. So I didn't think I was going to be hit. And I was lucky because I wasn't. He stopped. But he did raise his hand as if he was going to do it. But I think I raised my hand slightly higher. As I said, I'm from Balham. So I took my neighbor in and spoke to her, and she was in a terrible state. And she was in a terrible state because of what had happened to her, but also because she'd left both her children in the house with her husband. And to put it mildly, he was in a bit of a mood. So I gave her a brandy and had two myself, and spoke to her, my friend and I spoke to her about what had happened. And this was not the first time it had happened. He had even thrown her downstairs when she was 5 months pregnant. She said that his mood swings were unpredictable. Anything could trigger him. And in this instance, what had triggered him was the fact she'd bought a pair of shoes. A pair of shoes. What she would do, if she bought anything for herself, she'd keep them at work and she'd keep all the receipts at work. But this one day she forgot and left the receipt in a handbag, and he found them. And he went ballistic. And that resulted in her being out on the streets, being beaten up by her husband, suffering not only that pain, but that humiliation of all your neighbors knowing. And of course, the first thing I was going to do was call the police. But she did not want me to call the police. She had 2 children, and she was really worried about them and what that would mean. And I know we often think, why don't you leave the so-and-so? Well, often it's the children that stop you doing it. The sacrifices that our mothers make for us is quite something. And I am a mother myself, and I know what that is. But I was really surprised that she wouldn't, take the law that was there to help her. There was no way she was going to do that. And in the end, she went back home after she'd calmed down, and that was the end of that. I don't know what's happened to her. My guess is life has not been easy for her. I moved houses shortly after that, but I've never, ever forgotten her. And I have witnessed and seen lots of horrible things since then, but that was the first time, and it was a bit of an eye-opener. And it was a bit of an eye-opener that not everybody lives the kind of life that I live. And at the same time that was happening to my neighbor in another continent, and in a place called Niger, a young girl of 12 called Hadijatu was being sold into slavery. She was sold to a tribal chief named Nerua. He was 46 years old, and she was sold for a total of the equivalent today of $695. In 1996, when this happened, and there she is there, an older version, slavery was not prohibited in Niger. But its constitution did guarantee equal protection of the law and equality of all before the law. The transaction that allowed her to be sold was called wahia. Wahia means the buying of a young slave girl to work as a servant or concubine. She became the sadaka, or the 5th wife, which means that she was non-legally married, but she had to work for free, and sexual relations were part of the bargain. For 9 years, she was subjected to regular physical, sexual, and psychological abuse. Her life was hell. And by the age of 21, Hadijatu had 4 children, 2 of whom survived. So not only was she subjected to all of that, but she watched 2 of her children die. In 2003, slavery was abolished in Niger, but it was not until 2005 that Nerua freed her. And he did this by means of a liberation certificate. But maybe he didn't actually mean it, because he didn't actually let her go. Her mother took ill, and she had to go and see her. So she took the advantage of that, and she ran away and did not return. Now, this is the bit where the law comes in. So after she'd run away, she went to the tribunal in Coney in 2006 to get her rights of freedom recognized. The tribunal ruled that she was never properly married to Karua, and so the liberation certificate was valid, and so she could live her own life. So you'd think that would be the happy ending. Surprise, surprise, it was not. Nerua found out about the tribunal decision and went to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal agreed with him and said that Hadijatu was still married to him and that he was her husband. She then took the case to the Supreme Court of Niger to request an application of the law against slavery, which had been abolished in 2003, to say that she was not married, and because slavery was illegal, she'd been kept against her will in a country that had abolished slavery. The Supreme Court sent the case back to the Court of Appeal on the grounds that the law relating to the marriage portion of her claim had not been applied properly. They didn't address the slavery issue. So if you're confused, not surprising, there's a lot going on. In the meantime, Nauru had heard that, oh, I forgot to say, in the meantime, after she left Nauru, she actually, thinking that she was free because that's what the tribunal said, she'd met a man of her choice and married him. So she'd entered another marriage, or what she thought was her first marriage. But no, Nauru, because the courts had then said that the first marriage was legal, he then went to the criminal court and accused her of bigamy. And she was put in prison. Yes. So after everything that she had suffered, she now found herself in prison for bigamy. She in turn filed a case against Nauru for slavery, which was a criminal case. So there are lots of these cases going on right now, but in the meantime, she's still in prison. She was eventually released by the Court of Appeal on the basis that she had a right to divorce. Somewhere in those cases, that was decided. But she thought, you know, enough is enough. I have rights, they're not being recognized. She decided that she was going to take this to a more international level. So, in December 2007, she filed a submission before the Economic Court of West African States, ECOWAS. And ECOWAS is the regional court in Western Africa that deals with human rights. In her submission, Hajiatu sought to obtain judgment against the Republic of Niger for failure to protect her rights. And she had 4 claims. The first one was a claim of discrimination. The second one was slavery. The third, crimes against humanity, and the fourth, arbitrary imprisonment. In relation to the first one, ECOWAS found that the Republic of Niger was not responsible for her discrimination. In fact, it was the society in which she lived. As to slavery, they did find in her favor and said that the Republic of Niger was responsible for not having protected her and for having recognized her slave status. It also decided that it was responsible for its administrative and judicial passivity and inaction in allowing all of this to happen. They found they didn't have jurisdiction on the crimes against humanity point, but on the arbitrary imprisonment, i.e. when she was put in prison for the bigamy, they didn't find for her in relation to that. What they said, it wasn't arbitrary, it was a judicial process. She was put in prison lawfully. So, in her case, not what you'd expect as an outcome when you hear the story. You think it's one of those open and shut cases. You think the law would apply in a particular way. It didn't. She went through an awful lot of suffering. And I want to now bring you to another case of another woman in a different continent. And this was happening a few years before, when that picture of me playing the saxophone, a few years before that, this case was going on in Brazil. And this is the case of a Brazilian biopharmacist, Maria de Penha. Maria was married to a Colombian University professor. He had abused her for years. His name was Marco Antonio. And he'd attempted to kill her not once, but twice. The first time, he shot and paralyzed her. The second time, he tried to electrocute her in the bath. This is her husband, by the way. But clearly, Maria was made a kryptonite because he did not succeed. And in fact, Maria de Penha is alive today. But not surprisingly, she filed for a legal separation. She also filed a criminal complaint against her husband, Marco Antonio. And he was sentenced several times for those attempted murders. He was sentenced in 1991, he was sentenced in 1996, he was sentenced in 2001, but he never went to jail. He appealed. He did not go to jail at any point in time while this was going on. So Maria de Peña was seen in her wheelchair, but she was not heard. So again, she decided to go to the international courts. She filed a complaint with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights here in DC to censure Brazil for condoning domestic violence perpetrated by her then ex-husband. She claimed that Brazil had been in violation of its international commitments based on the American Convention of Human Rights. The Commission concluded that Brazil had violated the rights of Maria de Peña to a fair trial, to judicial protection, and to equality before the law. It also concluded that these violations constituted a pattern of discrimination, a pattern of ineffective judicial actions by Brazil against domestic violence against women, and that there had been a general pattern of government intolerance against violence against women. In other words, Brazil had failed to take effective measures to prevent and punish domestic violence against women. In March 2002, the Commission recommended Brazil complete the criminal proceedings against Maria de Peña's husband. And finally, after nearly 20 years, and almost the statute of limitations almost barred the case from being brought, he was arrested and he was put in prison. But he only served in the end a short term behind bars, and he was free again by 2007. As tragic and as heartbreaking as Maria de Peña's story was, she was eventually seen and she was eventually heard. Because in August 2006, which is not that long ago, following the recommendation of the Commission, the government of Brazil adopted a new federal law against domestic violence, and it named it in the honor of Maria de Peña. The law Maria de Peña was introduced into Brazil and created significant Brazilian legislative change, and has contributed substantially to the prevention of domestic violence in that country. Today, Maria de Peña is 72 and continues her life as a women's rights activist. The law Maria de Peña is considered internationally as one of the best laws against domestic violence in the world. And one more story for you. So whilst my neighbor was recovering from the beating that her husband had given her and choosing not to take up her legal rights that she had to report him, to prosecute him, to leave him because of her kids, another young mother, Nahid Opuz, was also suffering, and she lived in Turkey. She was a mother too. She was constantly threatened by her husband between 1995 and 2001. During those years, he attempted to run her down with his car. He brutally beat her, and he stabbed her numerous times. Nahid and her mother reported the danger to the Turkish police. They refused to investigate on the grounds that this was just a family matter, not for them to interfere. Then, one day in 2002, Nahid's husband shot and killed her mother. He was convicted for murder, but due to his good conduct during the trial, his original sentence was cut significantly. He was actually released after only a very short stay in prison. And upon his release, he started to threaten Nahid again. So she took the case to the European Court of Human Rights, which found that Turkey had violated the human rights of both Nahid and her mother. This was a landmark decision, as it recognized domestic violence as a form of gender discrimination that results in state responsibility. They had treated the murder of Nahid's mother as a normal murder and not a case of domestic violence. The court determined that whether the discrimination was intentional was irrelevant. There was widespread failure of law enforcement officials to act appropriately in these cases. So these stories illustrate how the law has been used and developed in the cases of gender-based violence. But as we know, gender-based violence is very widespread. It's not confined to any particular race, culture, social economic group, religion, country, neighborhood. It's everywhere. It is pernicious. Stories like the 3 women I spoke about can be found everywhere, unfortunately, and they're all over the world. The ones I've told you about are examples of domestic violence. There are many, many more examples of that kind of violence. And of course, every day we hear about gender-based violence against women in war, in just trying to get to college or school. It is quite terrible. And it is not something that is someone else's problem or some other country's problem. Not long ago, and I'm sure you all remember the case of Josef Fritzl in Austria, who kept his own daughter in the cellar for years and fathered 6 children with her. And no one knew that was going on. It was going on their doorstep. So we cannot assume that it's some other person's problem. Now, gender-based violence itself is costly. As Lucinda mentioned, from a human, psychological, and economic point of view, the number of women missing globally is about 200 million. What that means is that as a population, we have lost 200 million women over time to gender-based violence. They're simply not here anymore. This is comparable to the size of large populations like Brazil, Pakistan, and Nigeria. And gender-based violence has taken the lives of more women than the combined total of those killed in many recent wars. That's how many women we are missing because of gender-based violence. It currently costs the global economy $1.5 trillion. And just to remind you, that's the equivalent of the entire GDP of Canada. This is a serious, serious issue for the world. It has destroyed and continues to destroy the lives of millions of women around the world. And for those who've survived such violence, it also destroys the lives of the men in their families, their sons, their husbands, their fathers. And I wasn't going to say much about the World Bank. I'm just going to say we do have a wonderful publication on sexual and gender-based violence that's available on our website if you want to read some more about it and read some of the background to this particular issue. And I do recommend it, and it's free. So the role of international law. I'm just going to say a little bit about that. And I've put up here some of the different international instruments. They're there. But I think we've got to ask ourselves, how are they used and what is their impact? You can have the law there, but it doesn't necessarily change the way that things are. And I'll give an example. It's not one of these, but I'll just give a general example. In the UK, for example, where I grew up, at the time of those pictures, black and white pictures, which is not that long ago, by the way. Honestly, it isn't. You could sack a woman if she got pregnant. That was the law. You were allowed to do that. Okay, clearly you can't do that now, but back then you did it and no one thought anything of it. It's not that long ago that women really had very few rights and had very few economic rights. So economic equality is important. And without it, gender-based violence is actually going to be more prevalent in society. The discrimination that results in the labour market and in access to resources increases women's vulnerability to violence. That's a fact. So taking action to ensure gender equality and gender economic equality is actually smart economics. Economically empowered women are major catalysts for development, usually investing in their family's health, nutrition, and education. Studies have found that violence against women and girls can be reduced when economic empowerment projects are combined with interventions to improve communications within household. According to a recent study in Tanzania, women who experience intimate partner violence earn 29% less than women who did not. And women who experience severe intimate partner violence earned 43% less than those who did not. Let me leave that thought with you. And as was up at the moment, if Christian can put that back up, those slides, the current range of international instruments seeking to combat gender-based violence exists. They're there. They've been there for a while. But like other laws, and like the equal pay laws, and that many countries have now introduced, it doesn't necessarily stop anything. It doesn't necessarily stop discrimination. Many countries have introduced, if we take equal pay as an example, laws around equal pay, but women are still paid less than men. So it's not just the law that makes a difference, it's the culture and the cultural values that go around that and how we implement that. So although international law does mobilize women's groups and influences national laws, and going back to gender-based violence still affects women in every part of the world. Every part of the world. And also in relation to that threat of it that I just want to come back to. And I have done this with many audiences, and I'm not going to do it with you, but I will tell you what actually happens when you do it with an audience. So if I were to ask all the women in the audience to put up their hand, if they have never in their lives ever felt the threat of sexual violence, ever in their lives, where they thought, you know what, I'm going to leave the room now, or I'm going to get off the train, or I'm not going to do XXX. I'm not going to ask you to do it, but I can assure you, if I did ask the women in this room to do it, not one single hand would go up. You see, they're nodding their heads because everyone has been there. You cannot get to be in this room at this age and that not have happened to you at some point in your life. So for the men in the room, that's the threat your daughters, your wives, your mothers, your aunts, your teachers, etc. live under. So every day is in fact a challenge for us women. We've got used to it. We're almost been rewired for it. We're almost hardened to it. And in fact, sometimes we need people to point out to us it shouldn't be like that. But because it's like that, it can sometimes mean that we make different choices to the choices men make, such as the jobs we take, the places we go, the things we can do after work. We have been hardwired to know the dark is dangerous for women. We're taught that from a very, very young age. We are taught it's very dangerous going out in the dark on your own. Try to travel with someone else. That can really hamper some of the things you want to do in life, but we are taught that that is how it is, and that's how it is for all women. And for some women, it's even more dangerous. That is our reality. So to get that economic empowerment that will then lead to less gender-based violence is a challenge and will not happen without the world being made a safer place for women. So what can we as lawyers do? Are we powerless? Does international law value women's rights? Well, we have seen that it has done in some cases. We've seen all the laws that are there to help us. But there is no doubt that there is more to do and that there is more that we can all do. And let's not forget, it's not the law that stops gender violence, it's the culture in society. And we can all play a part in that. And imagine what this world might be like if we hadn't lost those 200 million women. Maybe we would have some more inventions. Maybe we wouldn't have had some of the inventions we've had that really haven't done society much good. Who knows? We can't tell, but we've lost them and we can't get them back. So in wrapping up, I just want to end with a few thoughts. As I said, I'm a child of 3 continents. Nigeria, where my dad was from, Trinidad, where my mum was from, and UK, where I grew up. It's not as if any of those places would have been any safer for me than any other one of those places. That is actually the reality. I was just very lucky. I didn't face any of this in my life. It allowed me to make the choices I've made. It's allowed me to do the career that I now have because I didn't face any of the challenges those 3 women I talked to you about had faced. But it could have been me. In the UK, for example, estimated about 1.3 million women face domestic violence. Female genital mutilation is also, again, it is against the law in the UK, but people think about 6,000 young girls who've suffered it. There's been one prosecution, but no one has been found guilty. Nigeria, where my dad was from, female genital mutilation, again, is quite prevalent in that society. And in Trinidad, where my mum was from, there is quite a bit of domestic violence. Nowhere is safe for women. You put a pin in a map, you're not going to be any safer anywhere. You may be luckier in some cases, but it's not that you're going to find some safe haven where it doesn't happen, and we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that. But before I go, and I want to leave you on a high note because it's quite a heavy topic, I appreciate. But I want to leave you with 2 quotes from Martin Luther King about the law. Oh, yes, this is a photo of me, by the way, holding my honorary doctorate from City University. And that's just to illustrate that was very important to me when I received that honorary doctorate. I was very proud. I was very honored and I was very proud. But I also felt that there are probably so many women in the world that wouldn't get a chance to do something like that, even just study law, even just go to school, even just enter secondary school because of the threat of violence for them, or because violence had stopped their lives in some way. And when I had to give a speech when I was getting that doctorate, and I very much had those young girls in my mind when I was doing that, and thinking that, you know, my life had been blessed. I had been very, very lucky. And I committed, as I've always done, to ensure that I wouldn't stop talking about it just because I was about to get very, very busy with a very, very big job. So hence I'm here today. So just before I wrap up, I want to leave you with 2 quotes from Martin Luther King about justice and the law. The first one, which is, "Law and order exist for the purpose of establishing justice. And when they fail in this purpose, they become dangerously structured dams that can block the flow of social progress." And the last one, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sandy, for sharing your story and their stories, and particularly for making the linkage between violence and economic equality, which I think is a very important observation. I just want to say before we close the session and go to our receptions or plans for this evening that the Society is engaged in many ongoing activities that address gender-based violence, including a series of programs we've convened over the past several years on gender violence in the course of armed conflict and the plight of those who seek refuge as a result of such violence. These issues are also a major focus of the annual International Humanitarian Law Dialogues, which the Society has co-sponsored and helped organize for the past 10 years. Now, following the reception this evening, we're going to be hosting a screening and discussion of a documentary film that addresses one of the milestones in the international effort to hold perpetrators of gender-based violence accountable. The Uncondemned is the story of Akayesu, the Akayesu case before the Rwanda Tribunal, which was the first successful prosecution of rape as a war crime. And that film is going to be screened tonight at 7:30 in this very room, Regency A. Let me also note, between then and now, we have 2 additional events taking place this evening. The Whiten Case ASIL ILSA reception next door starting at 6 p.m. And the reception also down on this level in similar locations, honoring the launch, celebrating the launch of the Benjamin Ferencz International Justice Initiative, sponsored by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. So I hope to see you at one or both of those events. Again, thanks to our keynote speaker, and thanks to you for attending this session. Have a pleasant evening.